Welcome to Dr. Rod's Bike Surgery. This is a programme on men and motors where I take a look at the problems that you, the viewer, are having with your bikes. My guest this week is Kevin Beadle from Solihull, who's brought his 550 Honda up for some steering head bearing work. So here we are on the bench. The first thing I'm going to suggest, Kevin, let's get the tank out of the way because we're going to be working up this area and I don't want to scratch this beautiful original paint. So to get the fuel tank off, we have to open the seat first, am I right?
Yeah, well, we need to take the fuel pipe off here. I've done this a couple of times for some other jobs. Right. So if I get the fuel pipes down, there are two actually on this, one to each of a pair of carburetors.
Right. That's quite unusual, isn't it? Normally a modern bike would have just one fuel feed.
Is that the way they do it? Yeah. That's one off. And that's the other, and then if you open the saddle up, so now all that's holding the tank on really is this rubber strap at the back here. There's no bolts, which makes it really quick. So I just loosen that strap, and then it just moves backwards. Moves backwards first.
You need to be careful not to scratch this. Beautiful, incredible paint jobs that they used to use on these, isn't it?
They did. You can't really reproduce it very well though.
Right, just put that safely out of the way for now. And then if we put the saddle closed again. Right, we can now see the front end of the bike. So what we're going to have a look at is the head bearings which are inside here and there.
Yeah.
Now that in itself is a fairly simple job, but getting at them is a bit more complex because what we're going to have to do is strip the whole front end of the bike. Right, so let's have a look at taking the front wheel off. It's probably going to be easier to take the mudguard off first on this bike. So what we need to do is remove these bolts at the bottom, and you've got one there which is already out. Yeah. That's great, right? We'll take these off at the other side. If you want to use that ratchet handle, I'll get a spanner on these. There are several ways of going about a job like this, of course. One way is to strip everything down slowly and painstakingly, which can be a lot of fun on a Sunday morning. But if you're doing this in a workshop and charging someone by the hour, then we need to look at a bit faster method of doing it. So next step, let's take the caliper off, then it'll give us a little bit more room to drop the wheel out. The calipers hold on with 3 bolts at the back and 2 of them hold the mudguard in place, so we've already removed them. So if you can get in there with a spanner, there's a single bolt at the back there.
Yeah, got it.
Which will release the caliper mounting. And while you're doing that, I'll just take this adjuster screw off the front and that should release the whole thing.
So this is the adjusting piece that's coming out now, isn't it?
That's right, yeah. It's a very unusual caliper design, in fact it was unique to Hondas. And they used variants of it on all the bikes from 750 all the way down to 250. Right. And the caliper should just lift off. Right, and we can actually see that there now. Yeah, that's the caliper assembly. First ever mass-produced motorbike front brake caliper. And it's an incredible design really. It's got one hydraulic piston in this side of the caliper body there. But in order to squeeze both pads together, the whole thing pivots on that arm there. So when you put the brakes on, the whole thing does this. And it's quite clever. It does mean that this pivot is rather a weak point. This one feels in pretty good condition. Yeah. But I've come across quite a lot of those where that's
seized up.
Yeah, it's pivoting at the top, but that pivot bolt is quite tight in there.
Right.
Now this may look like quite a major job, but actually all we're doing is steadily disassembling parts which are all bolted together. And as long as we work in a logical sequence, there shouldn't be too many problems. By removing the wheel, we've now got access to the fork legs, and it's going to be fairly straightforward to remove them. They're the key parts of the front suspension. It's also become quite obvious as well, as we've taken all the weight off the front end, the problem is quite pronounced and it's much easier to tell what it is that we're going to have to replace. Right, so next thing, let's drop the fork legs out. If you start with that one, there's a pinch bolt at the back there, can you see that?
Yeah, I can see that.
If you just slacken that one off, that should take a...
So it doesn't need to come right out, just slacken it.
Doesn't need to come right out.
It's got a little bit of yellow paint on it, I think that's where they...
Has it really?
When they made them, didn't they put that on to say it was done uptight? And it certainly was.
Indeed they did, yeah.
It's going to be...
Now if that yellow paint is intact, it's rather a shame to spoil it, because you're absolutely right, they used to do that at the factory. And if you see a bike like this still with yellow paint on the bolt heads, then it really is a mark of originality.
I think this is going to need something a bit stronger here, Rod.
Okay, let's get a bigger ratchet handle on it. That's a number 14 socket, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Right. And there we go, that's a 14, and we should have a nice big strong ratchet handle over here.
Oh, that looks more like it.
Right, have a go with that one. If I just hold that steady. And this certainly hasn't been... Oh dear.
That's original
for 30 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, that certainly has so. Right, just off a few turns, that's enough.
That's fine, yeah. Now if we're lucky, the fork leg will just slide out of the bottom.
I've got my fingers crossed. Right, does that help?
Yes, indeed it does. Fingers, legs and arms. Just pop the gate off the fork leg there, and then we can get hold of it. Oh, that's a bit tight on there. Ooh. Now then, do you see the rainwater come out of that?
Yeah, it is. It's just rainwater, not
oil.
oil.
It was lurking in there, and there's a little bit of rust in there too, but nothing major.
So that may be one of the reasons I didn't put these on all of them, because it traps the water.
Absolutely. There are two schools of thought about gaiters. Yeah. One school of thought says they're a really good idea because they protect the stanchions. But of course you're absolutely right. Yeah. The opposite camp says you get water and they get dirt in there and it holds it in. So, tell me about your interest in classic bikes, Kevin. This is quite a specialised kind of an interest, isn't it?
Yeah, I suppose they weren't classic when I got the first ones, to be honest with you. Got my first bike when I was at school, just for transport. And right through college, I had a whole series of mainly Hondas. Right through the winter, through the bad weather, everything else, but it's just transport. But you know, you get the bug, don't you?
But you've always been a Honda man, I
almost always. Although my first bike was a Suzuki, a little Suzuki 80, but mainly Hondas, yeah. And then, like a lot of people, you get a car and you have a family and you move on. I guess there was a gap of about 20 years.
Really?
But then had a big birthday and a few people brought photographs along, because back in '75 went on a sort of European tour with a friend on two identical Honda 504s.
Really? That's almost the same model, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. We got all over the place, got to Istanbul. I can claim I've been to Asia on a bike, because if you cross the bridge, you're in Asia. Didn't like it much, so I turned around and came back again.
Fantastic. How old were you when you did that? Sorry, if that's not too personal a question.
No, I was 22.
Wow,
when I did that.
Quite an adventure, isn't it?
Yeah, so then when people reminded me I was getting older, and I went searching for the same bike.
And you've got other bikes at home as well, I believe?
I've got a 250, which in a weak moment last year, I bought and decided to restore. It's been christened Rusty by the family.
Is that because it is?
Exactly. But I've worked on that through the winter, and all the bits I never used to want to take off the bikes when I relied on them and transport, I can play with it now and do that. So one day that'll be running, I hope.
Right, if I hold that gator up, if you get hold of the fork stanchion there and twist it and pull, hopefully that will now just draw out of the yokes. These do sometimes put up a wee bit of a struggle, but this one is playing ball with us today. Right, and again you can see surface rust.
Yes, quite
that was behind here.
Sure.
Doesn't matter.
So that's just cosmetic here.
That's just cosmetic. As the suspension works, the fork leg goes like that. And the bit that the suspension works on is this surface here. So as long as that's in good condition, this doesn't really matter. Right, so let's just take these handlebars off. They've got to come off anyway.
Yeah.
So if we just slacken these 4 bolts off. And do you have a 12mm socket there? We can just...
No, I thought I had. It's a 13. I'll go and have a look in the drawer.
There should be one. Perhaps I've left it
on there.
That's the one. It's on there. Right. And these 4 bolts just clamp the handlebars onto the top yoke. Actually, on this bike, they also hold the warning lights on, which is a rather nice period touch. But with those out, whoa, there we go. And this is where we start to get lots of loose bits. And this is why we've got a nice pink fluffy blanket to hold everything together. Okay, is that coming out all right?
Yep, they're fine. Quite long bolts, these.
Yeah, they go all the way through into the top yoke. And
I know when it goes back together, I read it in the shop manual, I think you either do the front ones or the rear ones first, and then it clamps it down from the other side. Yes,
that's right.
There's a particular way they advise doing it.
Yeah, I would always clamp these from the front and then the rear ones.
Right.
But you frequently find there's an arrow on the clamps that tells you which one to do. Having said that, I think Japanese designers were perhaps just a little bit too obsessive about making sure they had an assembly order for everything.
Sure.
Certainly, it always used to amuse me that the Kickstarter, for instance, has got Kickstarter written on it.
Just in case you used it for some other purpose.
Yeah. In case you thought it was a coat hanger. Right, if we just pop these bolts out of the way, so we don't lose them. And now, if we lift that clamp up and the handlebars should just lift out, like that. Now, of course, what we do still have is lots of cables and hoses and pipework, which is holding everything together. But I can now get access to that nut at the top.
What about the brake master cylinder now? Can that go horizontal without leaking, or is that a problem?
Yes, it can. It doesn't want to be left like that. No. It can be put upside down, really, for the few, for the half hour or so that the bike's going to be apart. If you left it upside down for months on end, you'd have problems. You'd have to re-bleed all the hydraulic system. But they're quite tolerant of working at different angles for a short period of time. Join us in part 2 when we try and put all this lot back together. Welcome to part 2. My guest this week is Kevin Beadle from Solihull, who's brought his 550 Honda up for some steering head bearing work. How do you think the job's going so far, Kevin?
Well, it's a bit scary, isn't it, seeing it all coming apart, but you know, I've read it in the books, but it's good to do it here with somebody who knows what they're doing. And
oh, thank you. I'm pleased to hear that.
So far I'm happy it's going really well.
It looks like pretty drastic surgery, doesn't it, when you
does.
get all the front end
Yeah,
off?
it suddenly doesn't look like a bike anymore at one point, does it?
How did you feel when the big hammers came out and we started bashing bits out of the frame?
Well, that's probably the worst bit, but no, we're there now, so I think we can start putting it back together again. I'll be a lot happier then.
Sure. Right, and a bit more this side. We could do with 2 rubber hammers for this, really.
We could, yeah.
Should be hitting this in unison. Or even in harmony.
Ah, here we go.
There she goes.
It's really moving now.
Right. Hopefully we can lift that yoke off. Very nearly. That's still just a wee bit tight, isn't it? Any fingers? That's it. Right, now all this assembly we need to just swing aside, and again watch out for the cables and such. Right, there we go, we're nearly there now. This doesn't look a bit scary, does it?
Just a lot.
Okay, just be careful. We've got things dangling on cables now, we've got delicate things like speedos, ref counters, some of which is irreplaceable. Right. We need to make sure that nothing gets bashed or scratched. Right, on here now, we've got the winkers, which are captive on the headlamp brackets, and that headlamp bracket is moving, so that's encouraging. What I want to do is slide that headlamp bracket off. We're going to have to disconnect the wire for the winkers to do it. Okay. Unfortunately.
Well, that's inside the headlamp.
That's inside the headlamp shell. So we need to trace which are the wires for the winkers, and we need to reconnect them up later on as well.
Now, they're all black. I guess they're not colour-coded because they're visible, is that?
Partly, yes.
For neatness. Because if it's like another bike I worked on, they'll have a little colour code right on the end of the cable, maybe.
If you have access to a digital camera, it's a really good idea to take lots of pictures when you're dismantling something like this. Look at the problems we're having struggling with the wiring in the headlamp shell. Now, lots of people are frightened to death of this kind of coloured spaghetti, and it's a scare that you're not going to get everything back together properly. Take some pictures of it, keep the pictures, and then it's going to be really easy to use those as a guide later on. Right, with the wiring sorted now, we've got the winkers disconnected. So if you hold that lot there, now I can get at the top of the forklift.
Okay, and I've got a full-time job here.
Indeed you have, you may be stuck there for the rest of the day. Rubber hammer, and now, the advantage with the rubber hammer is I can hit this quite hard without damaging anything. Yeah. And you can see that now starting to come down through the yokes. That's taking quite a lot of persuasion. And what I don't want to do is damage this headlamp bracket here. So I'll take that down as far as I can, and then I'm hoping I can slide it out of the bottom yoke without any further problems. Let's see what's happening at this end now. And it's going to be tight all the way, is that one. So again, I'm going to try the screwdriver trick in this little slot on the yoke, just to take the load off it. No, and it still doesn't want to play ball, so I'm afraid I'm going to have to tap that a bit further. Ah, there she is, yes. Oh, there we go, my worst fears are allayed. I thought that was going to be a real struggle, but it's coming.
And I bet the workshop manual wouldn't say anything about that, would it?
Well, to be fair, I mean, the people who write the workshop manuals wouldn't be taking 30-year-old bikes to bits. You can hear the rust in that. It's going to be interesting to see what it's like. Oh dear, there she is, look at that. And that's been the problem. Now again, that's the bearing surface of the front suspension, and that's fine. Okay. But up here, that rust has extended all the way down into the bottom yoke there. So that fork leg was rusted into the bottom yoke. When that goes back together, we'll have some grease on it. Yeah. So it's nothing too dramatic, but oh dear.
Would you take a bit of emery to it, or is that too
I don't think you need
powerful?
To bother.
No.
What you will find on these as well, you know, you were talking about the polished bits that they could see. On these early Honda fork stanchions, this is a hard industrial chrome finish that goes to there. And they frequently didn't plate the upper half of the stanchion because it's behind the chrome cover. Yeah. So if you do emery that off, it's just going to be rusty again in a few months' time. But after 30 years, if that's all the rust there is, that could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, it could.
All we need to do is grease that when it goes back in, and it'll be fine for another 30 years.
And again, how does the seal look on that one? A little bit messier than the other side?
There's some corrosion in the top there, but again, I think that's just a function of having moisture in there. It works fine, and there's no sign of an oil leak. Okay. So there's no need to be stripping that down.
Good.
Now, does all this lot swing out of the way? And we've got some cables and wiring. Now what I'm going to do is lift this lot off around the yoke. We need to remember where it was, because it needs to go back in the same way. That's the main wiring harness.
It is.
It's out of the way. That cable there, like that. So all of those cables need to be hooked up over the top yoke, over the bottom yoke rather, when it goes back together. Okay. And that should now, look at the water running out of that. Is that coming out of the headlamp shell?
Don't think so.
Picked up some rainwater somewhere. Anyway, not to worry.
No, it's coming out of this buzzer.
Out of you, right. So perhaps it doesn't work then. We're nearly there now. There's the bottom yoke at last. And now, I don't know if you can see that, but
yeah,
that's how rough it is in the bearings.
That's really horrible, isn't it?
Certainly is.
In fact, now it's in this state, you wonder how the bike ever steered at all.
Incredible, really, isn't it? Yeah.
And yet that isn't a bad one.
No, I've seen much worse than that. This is where we'll be adjusting the new bearings when we put it all back together again. If I take that off there, that's the adjuster ring out of the way. It was a bit rusted on that thread there, and just pop that there for the moment. When I drop this out of the way, lots of 1/4" steel balls will fall out and roll all over the floor. But the good news is we don't need to put them back in again. So if we do lose some, it's not the end of the world. Okay. Right, there's the yoke coming out, and you can see some of those 1/4" steel balls at the bottom. There we go, and that's the bottom steering head bearing. Okay. It's the old one. There we go, those are all the balls falling out. We don't need those again, because we're going to be putting nice new fresh ones in. And at the top, there we go, that's the top steering head bearing. Okay.
Which one's more likely to be causing the problem? Is it the bottom one that's taking the weight?
Yes, that's exactly the case. And if we clean that one up, there's some old grease on that, but we'll give it a clean and we should be able to see, hopefully, where the wear's taking place. Okay. But you would always replace these as a set. You always do the top and bottom together, but you're absolutely right, it's the bottom one that takes all the load, because all the weight of the bike is on that bottom bearing.
And I guess suspension forces as well, the shock loading will come up that way.
Braking loads as well, yes. Yeah. And when you see these chaps tearing around on racetracks and pulling wheelies and then coming down quite hard, that's what takes all the load. Right. Yeah. Now we've got the bottom yoke removed from the steering head, we can see how the bearings were assembled at the factory. These old ball bearings were quite a good thing in the day, but we are going to be replacing them with ultra-modern taper roller steering head bearings, which will solve all of these problems and make the bike handle better than it ever used to do. Right, next step, let's get the old bearings out of the steering head. We've got one in here and one in there. Now this is where it starts to get a little bit scary, because these are an interference fit in the frame, which means we've got to bash them out with a hammer. Okay. You're going to have a go at this, Kevin?
I'll give it a go.
Good man.
You just want me to break my own bike, don't you?
Well, hopefully that won't happen. Okay. There's a drift, and this is a specially handmade drift for the job. Okay. And that goes in there, and it hits against the edge of the bearing. Got the idea, so what I'm going to suggest is if we put that in there and tap it, and then there.
So it needs to go around and tap each side.
So you tap each side, and as you tap it down, the bottom bearing should come out like that. Okay.
You'll be underneath to catch it.
I'll be underneath to catch it, of course.
Let's give it a go.
I'm going to suggest use this hammer. It's quite a big, heavy hammer for this, but it's got a copper face on it, which will absorb a little bit of the shock. That's it, and again at the other side. Because it's a big, heavy hammer, it's quite easy to swing it with some...
Feels to me like it's moving, is it?
I very strongly suspect that it's coming, yeah. That's it. And by work, there it comes. Okay. And there's your old bearing.
That wasn't quite as bad as I thought.
But this part of the bearing now needs to go into the frame, and this is going to replace a bit that you've bashed out at the bottom.
And that's got a right and a wrong way up, hasn't it? Because it's a taper.
Because it's a taper, it's angled like that. Yeah. So it needs to go that way up.
Is it obvious which way?
If you have a look at the outer, you'll see there's a number on there which identifies a bearing size. Yeah. And that land is wider.
Okay, got it, yeah.
Okay. Right, what we'll do now is just offer that up into place. I've put some fresh grease on that bottom bearing and hopefully,
okay,
there we go, that sits into
hold on
there.
to that.
If you just support that, if you will, Kevin, and the new top bearing, of course, now drops down onto that stem and sits in the bit that we put in the frame. And look at that, that's beautiful. Now you'll see on here there are two different threads.
Yeah.
The first thread, in other words the lower one, takes this adjuster ring. And that goes on first and spins down. The top thread takes a big chrome nut off the top of the top yoke. And the function of that ring there is to preload the bearings. So if it's too slack, the thing will rattle about.
Yeah.
And if it's too tight, it'll bind and become stiff.
Okay.
The ideal condition for that is to have 0 preload.
Okay.
So there's no load on the bearings and they're free to turn.
But then when you tighten up the top nut, will that tend to squeeze this?
Yes. It shouldn't do, but it always does.
Right.
So what I'm going to suggest is we set that up just by hand for now, so that feels more or less okay.
Okay.
The final job when we've assembled everything else is then to make a final check of the adjustment of the bearings. From here now then, what I'd suggest is we hold all this gubbins up here and let's hook the cables back over the yokes as they were, back over the bottom yoke as they were.
Yeah, can you remember how that was?
Well, if you lift it up, hopefully it should be fairly obvious. And of course this is where it would be really useful to have any pictures if you were doing this for the first time. There we go, that looks about right to me. Those cables are on the top there, and there's your brake pipe. Right now, if you can lift the top yoke up, and it should drop onto the steering stem there, like that. And very rapidly, whoops, it starts to look like a motorbike again. This test ride is essential to make sure that the bike is handling as it should. The steering head bearings will make quite a difference to the way the bike feels, and it's entirely possible that Kevin will have to relearn how to ride the bike. It also gives everything a chance to bed in, so we'll be checking it all over when it does come back to the workshop. And that's another problem solved on Dr. Rod's bike surgery, and Kevin's bike is now back on the road. So come back and join us again soon.